So I'm going to change it a little bit. I'm going into some more recent history. Since the last glaciation, this is a map of how the glacier used to cover North America. And what's interesting is where we are, the Potomac watershed was never covered by glaciation ever in its 700 million year history. During that time period, though, the sea level was much lower. It was, it was 60, 70 miles offshore on the east coast. But we were never covered. So I'm going to go into a little bit about timing of what happened to the landscape since in the last 22,000 years. So again, this is a new map, but it's the same time here basically. You got this ice covering. This is what the plants look like. The yellow is tundra, which is there's no trees. It's kind of like grassland. And then this taiga, these colors here are a spruce forest. And then down below, very far south, you have the temperate forest that we have here now. What I find interesting is this 9-inch stone blade was found off the coast of Ocean City, basically about 40 miles off the coast of Ocean City, where people used to live 17,000 years ago. And they used this 9-inch blade as a spear point that they would have hunted mammoths with. But what's also interesting about this stone is it was determined that it came from Emmitsburg, rocks in Emmitsburg, Maryland now. So it came from basically above where we are, and then it was used by people that lived out here. So there was a lot of, people were moving a lot in those time periods 17,000 years ago, especially in this eastern part of the United States. And this is a map of the Americas showing basically paths that people took to come to America to populate the Americas. This lower was kind of interesting because recently when the seas were 400 feet lower than they are now, there was a group of islands that went right along in here, so they could have moved from island to island. They didn't really have to sail so far. But what's another thing that's really interesting is these sites here. This is a map showing the oldest habitation sites documented in the United States, and Metocraftoft in Pennsylvania, is west of Pittsburgh, is the oldest one at 17,000 and 19,000, and then Cactus Hill down in Virginia near Petersburg is also old, and we're right in the middle of that. So we know there were people living here during that time period. Some of the most ancient people. How they came is still a debated topic. Okay, now we're at about 14,000 years. The ice is starting to move up, and this ice is miles high ice. It's not something short; it's tall. But the temperate forests are starting to move north. The tundra and other things are moving north. But there's also an interesting phenomenon that happened about 10,000 years ago. It's called Meltwater Pulse 1A. I advise you to look that up on the internet. That's when sea levels, which were 400 feet below what they are now, this is a map showing sea levels from the last end of the glaciers till present day. Well, the sea levels rose about 100 feet in just a few, maybe as little as 40 years to maybe 250 years, which is really fast. And most of it was from this thing melting and pouring water. This is when Lake Superior was formed. Lake Superior is one of the deepest lakes in the world, and that was carved. It's just 12,000 years old. It was carved by this water falling off this huge ice thing, and it's amazing. So after this big event, the Meltwater Pulse 1A, there was actually a pretty dry period. A lot of dust came from the west, forming dust layers that are like 20, 30 inches deep in this whole area, in Chesapeake Bay as well. But 11,000 years ago, just to kind of go quicker, again, it's warming up. You'll see things moving far north. Here, the temperate mixed forest 8,000 years ago, which is close to what we have today. This is the present day, the cool temperate forest, warm temperate forest, grassland. So this is what we have today. Now, there was a period, though, from about 900 to 1300 AD when you had a very warm period came, and that changed the landscape a lot. So this medieval warm period is when, again, corn arrived. The corn culture came up from the southwest. They moved up into the mid-Atlantic. So about 900 AD is when we got corn here, and that changed the landscape a lot. People became farmers. They weren't hunter-gatherers so much. They became more farmers, and that supported a lot more population. The population increased a whole lot. you could grow corn way up into Canada with no problem, and people were, you know, the Native American population really increased during that period. But then, circa 1400, what's known as the Little Ice Age occurred, and that went all the way to 1850, basically just before a Civil War was the Little Ice Age. Things became a lot colder, so they couldn't grow corn basically north of the Potomac watershed. It was too chilly to grow corn, so a lot of the northern tribes needed food, so they were raiding the southern tribes, and you got into a lot of tribal conflict. That's why Powhatan's grandparents formed the Powhatan Confederacy, uniting a bunch of tribes, Algonquin tribes, to fight the Iroquois that were coming down to fight to take their food. So I'll spend a little time. This is an interesting map that really is from a John Wesley Powell map, but it shows the linguistic map. It's a map of the different languages, the basic languages that were spoken in the Americas. So where we are, right here, this red dot, we're in an interesting place because you've got just north of us, north of the Potomac, were the Iroquois. South and east were Algonquin tribes, and then you had Monacan tribes to the west of us, and most of West Virginia, and also Siouan people. There were Siouan people, speaking people. They actually ran up the Blue Ridge, the eastern side of the Blue Ridge were Siouan speaking people. So Sioux, we think of them out west. We have this little island of Sioux. That shows how there was this warfare going on where people were moving down from the north and conquering and splitting people up and making isolated islands, linguistic islands related to warfare that was going on at the time. Subsequently, when the Europeans started arriving, you have what's called the Columbian Exchange period, where various products were brought over from the Americas, introduced to Europe. Things like sweet potatoes, tobacco, peppers, peanuts, potatoes, tomatoes. Those are things. Potatoes. Oh, that's Irish. No, potatoes are American. Similarly, Italian cooking with tomatoes. They didn't have tomatoes until the Americas were sort of discovered. Corn, a lot of good things, and similarly, they brought over cattle, bees, bananas. Lots of things came over, including two of my favorites in this exchange were the coffee exchange and the chocolate exchange. So those are very important. And I've got to mention also the diseases. We know about the diseases that came to the Americas from Europe, but other diseases like smallpox, influenza, a group of them, the Americans didn't have any resistance to them. Well, syphilis came from the Americas and killed about 10 million Europeans when it arrived with the Columbus crew. But the Native Americans are here in this area, and again, I'm sort of focusing on Jefferson County. They were here for, since 17,000 years or so. And one of the main ways of getting food was construction of weirs in the middle of the rivers and streams that would channel the fish into a concentrated area where they could harvest them. Here's an example of one. This is I-81. This is a weir you can see from a satellite image that goes across the whole river. Here's one that's near the NCTC National Training Center, and this is one down near Brunswick, Maryland. You see this V right here, that's an Indian fishing weir. Brunswick in the colonial days was called Eel Town because that's where the Native Americans were capturing fish, and the main fish they caught, the largest native predatory fish in the upper Potomac, was the American eel. And it's a delicious fish, and they were catching those and other fish, but the eel was a prime target. Here's a couple other pictures. You can see them in satellite images, these V's. This is near Big Pool. This fishing weir is near Town Creek, upstream from here. But they're all up and down the river. And again, they were fished by the landowners. Actually, they fished them. There were commercial watermen in Harper's Ferry up until the 1920s. They would harvest they'd harvest fish and sell them to the local supermarkets. That wasn't outlawed until 1926, the Black Bass Act, it was called, because largemouth and smallmouth bass were their principal fish they were harvesting. And these weirs were operated up until that date. Maryland had trouble making people stop because people have been fishing these weirs. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, they fished these weirs. I'm not stopping. But they were eventually made to stop. But their evidence, they're still there. Now I'm going to change topic and go into the Appalachian trees, which used to be huge. Our environmental memories are short-term, and the forests in the east have been cut for so long we've forgotten that there were really big trees in the east. This example here is an artist's depiction of one that's described by a Jesuit priest going with a bunch of Frenchmen down the Ohio, and he described a tree called a cottonwood, actually a sycamore tree, that 29 men met inside of the tree. So that's a pretty big tree. And I'll also spend a little time talking about a trip made by some local guys that went up to Blackwater Falls and went up the Potomac, up the North Branch Potomac over to Blackwater Falls in the 1850s.